Every day, roughly 100,000 flights cross the skies of planet Earth. Most people never think about the invisible highways that make that possible, the carefully negotiated corridors, the air traffic control zones, the overflight agreements between countries that quietly shape every route your plane has ever taken. For decades, one corridor carried the heaviest load on Earth, a dense, constant web of aircraft threading between Europe and Asia, right through the heart of the Middle East. Dubai, Doha, Abu Dhabi, the Gulf megahubs, the beating center of global long-haul aviation. Then, on a single Saturday in February 2026, it disappeared. Within hours, the skies above some of the world's busiest air routes went silent, not gradually, not with warning, all at once. This is the story of the hole in the sky. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what was built and just how long it took to build it. The Gulf megahubs did not happen by accident. For 30 years, the governments of the United Arab Emirates and Qatar made a conscious, strategic decision to position themselves at the center of global aviation. They invested billions in infrastructure. They built Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar Airways into world-class carriers. They constructed airports so large, so well connected, and so perfectly positioned on the globe that they fundamentally rewired the way the world traveled. Dubai International Airport, before this conflict, was the busiest international airport on Earth, not just in the Gulf, on the planet. Hamad International in Doha was regularly ranked among the best airports in the world. Abu Dhabi's Zayed International had just completed a $1 billion expansion. Emirates alone operated routes to over 140 countries. Qatar Airways had one of the youngest, most fuel-efficient wide-body fleets anywhere. These were not regional carriers serving local markets. They were the connective tissue of global aviation. The reason a business traveler could fly from Lagos to Tokyo with a single connection, or a family from Manchester could reach Bali for a reasonable fare, and sitting directly beneath their flight paths. Iran. A country whose airspace has always been politically complicated, but commercially essential. Every flight from London to Singapore, Frankfurt to Bangkok, Paris to Sydney. Most of them flew over or near Iranian territory. Some paid overflight fees directly to Tehran, fees that flowed into Iranian government coffers while Western diplomats argued over sanctions. Others skirted the northern or southern edges of Iranian airspace, threading carefully between restricted zones. The Middle East was what aviation analysts called a high-capacity bridge, one of the only routes on Earth connecting the population centers of Europe, Africa, South Asia, and East Asia in a single efficient arc. When that bridge worked, nobody talked about it. When it broke, the entire world felt it. This is not the first time Iran and civil aviation have collided, with devastating consequences. And to understand the full weight of what happened in 2026, you have to go back to a cold January morning in 2020. On January 8th of that year, Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 pushed back from the gate at Tehran Imam Khomeini International Airport. It was a Boeing 737-800, a common workhorse aircraft, the kind you've almost certainly flown on. 176 people were aboard. The plane climbed normally for a few minutes after takeoff. Then 2 Iranian surface-to-air missiles struck it. Everyone on board was killed. Iran's military had mistaken the commercial airliner for an incoming cruise missile. In the chaos of that night, with Iranian forces on high alert following US strikes on Iranian military commanders, someone at a missile battery made a catastrophic decision. The world was outraged. Aviation authorities updated their risk assessments. Several airlines temporarily suspended Iranian overflights. The International Civil Aviation Organization launched investigations. But within months, most flights were back to normal. The overflight fees were too valuable, the routings too convenient. Iran's airspace was too central to too many routes to avoid indefinitely. And so the world made a choice. The choice it almost always makes when safety and convenience are in tension. It chose convenience. That choice, as it turned out, was one the industry would eventually be forced to reckon with, because Flight 752 was not an anomaly. It was a warning that Iran operated advanced, layered air defense systems in close proximity to busy international flight paths. Systems that could be triggered with almost no warning. Systems that could not distinguish between a military target and a commercial airliner in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nobody wanted to hear that warning until there was no longer any choice. When United States and Israeli strikes on Iran began in the early hours of February 28, 2026, the aviation response was immediate and overwhelming. Airlines had been quietly monitoring the build-up for weeks. Risk assessment teams at major carriers had already prepared contingency reroutes. But when the strikes began, the scale of the closure was beyond what most planners had modeled. Within hours, 8 countries had declared their airspace closed: Iran, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates. That is not a regional inconvenience. That is the entire central hub of global aviation, going offline simultaneously. Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar Airways, 3 of the most powerful airlines on Earth, suspended operations. At Dubai International Airport, smoke could be seen from the terminals as Iranian retaliatory drone strikes hit the surrounding area. Abu Dhabi's Zayed International and Dubai International both suffered direct strikes. The airports that had taken decades to build were now under fire. More than 46,000 flights were cancelled in the first 2 weeks alone. Over 1 million passengers were stranded worldwide, people sleeping on terminal floors in Bali, in Dhaka, in Athens, in Nairobi, families separated by closed airspace and cancelled connections, crew members stranded in hotels, unable to fly home, unable to position for their next duty. One Qatar Airways flight attendant, stuck in Doha, posted a video to social media from her hotel room. You could hear the sound of missiles in the background. She said she never, in her entire career, imagined she would ever be saying that. Open a flight tracking app today, and the change is still visible. Where one of the world's densest aviation corridors used to exist, hundreds of aircraft at any given moment threading between continents, there is nothing, a void, a hole in the sky. When a route disappears, the aircraft do not vanish, they reroute. Aviation finds a way, it always does. But in this case, the alternatives were painful, expensive, and in some cases, genuinely dangerous. Airlines faced 2 main options. Go north, over Turkey, the Caucasus, through the airspace of Armenia and Azerbaijan, then into Afghanistan, which operates as uncontrolled airspace with no air traffic control service, before continuing through Central Asia toward East Asian destinations. Or go south, hugging the Egyptian coast and Saudi Arabia, keeping above 32,000 feet through a narrow, approved corridor over Oman before heading onward. Both routes add significant time. A flight from London to Singapore that once took 12 hours now approaches 14 or 15. That might sound like a minor inconvenience, but for aviation economics, it is a serious problem. For a wide-body aircraft like a Boeing 777 or an Airbus A350, every additional hour in the air burns thousands of dollars of fuel. Analysts estimated the added operational cost per rerouted long-haul flight at between $15,000 and $50,000 US. Multiplied across hundreds of daily departures, across weeks and months of conflict, that is a financial hemorrhage. And fuel costs themselves were spiraling. At the start of 2026, jet fuel cost around $2.11 per gallon. By early March, it had surged to $3.40, a 60% increase in under 10 weeks. Part of the reason was the near shutdown of tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply normally passes. With that choke point disrupted, the Persian Gulf's role as a supplier of around a quarter of Europe's jet fuel was suddenly in question. Airlines that had wisely hedged their fuel costs, locking in prices in advance, were cushioned. Ryanair, for instance, had 84% of its fuel for the quarter locked in at $77 a barrel. British Airways owner IAG had covered 75% of its near-term exposure, but carriers with no hedging at all, like SAS, were fully exposed to the surge. SAS announced the cancellation of 1,000 flights in April. United Airlines cut 5% of its total flights. Its chief executive began planning for oil at $175 a barrel and warned publicly that prices could remain above $100 through 2027. Ticket prices were already moving. Analysts found that US domestic fares for late March bookings had jumped between 15 and 124% depending on the route. The industry that had been forecast to post a record $41 billion in net profit in 2026 was now staring at a very different kind of year. The conflict raised another aviation story, this one military, and in many ways just as revealing. For weeks after the strikes began, the United States claimed total air dominance over Iran. The defense secretary announced that US forces had achieved complete control of Iranian skies. The president told reporters that Iran had no spotters, no radar, no anti-aircraft capability. USB-52 bombers, enormous, slow-moving aircraft designed for a different era, were being flown directly over Iranian territory. It looked, on the surface, like a demonstration of unchallenged supremacy. Then, on April 3rd, an F-15E Strike Eagle from the 494th Fighter Squadron went down over southern Iran, shot down. The first confirmed loss of a US combat aircraft since the conflict began. Iran, it turned out, still had teeth. It had been quietly husbanding its surface-to-air missile stockpiles, camouflaging systems in tunnels and culverts, waiting for the right moment. When that moment came, the result was the most complex combat search and rescue operation in modern US Special Operations history. The two-seat jet's pilot was recovered within hours, but the weapons systems officer, a colonel, ejected over the Zagros Mountains and evaded capture for days. 155 aircraft, hundreds of special operations personnel. A CIA disinformation campaign broadcasting false signals to confuse Iranian searchers. A race against Revolutionary Guard forces and local Bakhtiari tribesmen who knew every ridge of that terrain. The airman himself climbed a 7,000-foot ridgeline on foot, hid in a mountain crevice, and restricted use of his emergency beacon to avoid detection. At one point, he sent a short radio message. 3 words: God is good. He was recovered alive on Easter morning, April 5th. A sprained ankle, nothing more. But the shootdown had already done its damage. Not physical damage, but something more significant. It had cracked the narrative of total air dominance. Iran was still in the fight. And over the Strait of Hormuz, an A-10 Warthog had also been hit. A slow, ground-attack aircraft not designed for contested airspace, its pilot ejecting into Kuwaiti airspace before being quickly recovered. The sky over Iran was not the safe, permissive environment that had been advertised. So, where does all of this leave aviation? The Gulf megahubs, the airports and airlines that took 30 years to build into the world's most powerful aviation network, are now navigating an existential question, not just about operations, but about identity. The entire model was built on stability, connectivity, and the confidence of passengers that connecting through Dubai or Doha was not just convenient, but safe. That confidence, once shaken, does not return overnight. Around 1.7 million weekly seats had been removed from the region's airline schedules by mid-March, roughly a third of pre-war capacity. Airlines across Europe were simultaneously scrambling to fill the gap, adding frequencies on their own long-haul routes. Air France added flights to Bangkok, Singapore, Delhi, and Nairobi. Lufthansa added Munich to Singapore rotations. Air India added 36 additional frequencies to Europe and North America in a single 10-day window. A reshuffling of the global aviation map happening in real time. But history offers a thread of reassurance. Aviation has survived every crisis it has ever faced. September 11th, SARS, the volcanic ash clouds over Europe. The COVID-19 pandemic, which grounded more aircraft than any event since the invention of powered flight. The Russia-Ukraine airspace closure, which forced a permanent rerouting of European overflights eastward. Each time, demand eventually returned. Each time, the industry adapted and rebuilt. The question, as always, is not whether aviation will survive. It will. The question is what it looks like on the other side, which airlines emerge stronger, which hubs rebuild their dominance, and whether the Gulf Corridor, once the most important bridge in global aviation, can ever fully recover the trust it held before February 28, 2026. Aviation has always been a mirror of the world it flies over. When the world is open, the skies fill with aircraft. When the world fractures, the maps go dark, the routes bend, the economics strain. And somewhere in a hotel room in a city under fire, a crew member holds their phone to a window and records the sound of missiles, footage that no amount of pre-departure safety videos ever prepared them for. Right now, one of the most important corridors in aviation history sits largely empty. Every airline, every pilot, every route planner, every passenger booking a long-haul journey is watching that map, recalculating, rerouting, and waiting for the lights to come back on. Whether they do, and when, depends on forces that have nothing to do with aircraft, nothing to do with route efficiency or hub connectivity or fuel hedging strategies. It depends on whether two sides in a conflict on the other side of the world can find a way to stop. Until then, the hole in the sky remains. If you found this video valuable, subscribe and hit the bell icon. We cover the stories behind how the world moves, and right now, there is no bigger story in aviation than this one.